Before this video starts, a quick disclaimer. This video is based on the professional opinions of a single individual. Actual treatments of social withdrawal may differ from those presented here. If you are or someone you know is affected by long-term social withdrawal, do not rely on the information in this video, but seek professional help. This video deals with subjects like loneliness, depression, dysfunctional families, domestic violence, and death. So please watch at your own discretion.
In Japan, hundreds of thousands of people spend their entire lives in their bedrooms.
A million Japanese have been shunning society.
For nearly 3 years, Yuto Onishi's world was his bedroom.
Thousands of young men who lock themselves away in their bedrooms.
Sneaking out only in the dead of night to eat.
So these people effectively are living in their own world, detached completely from society.
As time goes on, surviving at home alone is becoming harder.
You may have heard of the word Hikikomori, a term describing Japanese hermits who live their lives shut inside their own rooms, avoiding all contact with society. Estimates of Hikikomori in Japan range from the hundreds of thousands to over 1 million, and with numbers like these, it's no surprise the problem has become somewhat famous. The term Hikikomori first became popular in Japan after the publication of a 1998 book titled Hikikomori: Adolescence Without End. The author, a psychiatrist named Tamaki Saitou, had become convinced during his clinical practice that there was a growing problem of social withdrawal in Japan. Moreover, he believed that there might already be as many as 1 million Hikikomori. At the time, that must have surely sounded like an absurd number, but newer data is proving him more right than wrong. Saitou certainly defends his initial estimate, saying that the government figures of 700,000 individuals in 2010 were probably on the low end, since people do not openly report having Hikikomori relatives. At the time of this video, Saitou is not just recognized as Japan's foremost expert on Hikikomori, but also as a well-known culture and media critic. He has written many books about Lacanian psychoanalysis and Japanese nerd culture. However, in Hikikomori, he maintains a very sober and pragmatic approach, because this book is not just an analysis piece, a work of cultural criticism, but an urgent message to the Japanese public and medical community to bring the problem of Hikikomori to light and start making steps toward fixing it. For that reason, he avoids placing blame or making judgments, regarding those actions as unproductive and, at worst, counterproductive. One of the things that sustains the vicious circle he calls Hikikomori's system is the sense of shame felt by the withdrawn individual. If others respond by heaping more guilt onto them, that's not going to help things. In fact, it can only make them worse. Right at the start of the book, Saitou attempts to get rid of these judgmental and dismissive attitudes. He opens by describing a handful of Hikikomori cases, asking the reader how they feel about them. Most people react negatively to such stories, and Saitou very much anticipates this. He continues with a few imaginary quotes that he believes a so-called upstanding citizen would make. One of them reads as follows: "If a person doesn't work, he doesn't deserve to eat. If he doesn't feel like working, he ought to go to a boarding school or something and get some sense beaten into him." Using these stories, Saitou attempts to relate to some of the negative preconceptions the reader might have. He then, however, proceeds to confront the reader by writing, "Sure enough, those are the sorts of reasonable opinions you might expect to hear upstanding citizens say. But what if there were tens of thousands of adolescents across the country who fit the descriptions I gave above? What if most of those young people were still unable to escape from their shut-in, withdrawn state after being subjected to quote-unquote reasonable opinions over and over again? This is not just a hypothetical question." Social withdrawal isn't something anybody wants, least of all the withdrawn people themselves. Saitou writes that no one wants to return to society more than a Hikikomori. However, there are certain mechanisms, vicious circles, active in that person's life, in their family life, and in society itself that prevent this from happening. To be able to properly treat hikikomori, the real problem needs to be understood. In order to describe this problem, Saitou borrowed a term from the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Disorders, social withdrawal, or shakaiteki hikikomori. However, social withdrawal isn't a mental illness. It only appears in the diagnostic manual as a symptom. Despite his insistence that being a hikikomori can be the primary issue, Saitou also never calls it a mental illness. He describes it more like a state, a vicious downward spiral that you can get sucked into, and the longer you stay in it, the more difficult it becomes to emerge. This is the reason why many hikikomori, even today, don't recover. They stay inside their rooms for years, decades, and sometimes until death. One of the most important points in Saitou's book is that social withdrawal can be a self-sustaining system. That means that for hikikomori, the initial reason behind their withdrawal isn't the only thing that's keeping them in a cycle of withdrawal. That doesn't mean the initial reason isn't important, though. Saitou finds in a survey that 90% of hikikomori patients used to go through periods of skipping school. They might have been bullied or socially outcast, or perceived some kind of devastating personal failure that caused them to want to hide from the world. Only then, as they continued to withdraw, it would become harder to interact with other people and rejoin the world. They might develop a social phobia or other issues like a fear of emitting body odor, which is surprisingly common among hikikomori in Japan. Now the person could fall prey to what Saitou has called a hikikomori system. There are 3 hikikomori systems, each taking place in a different arena. The first arena is that of the withdrawn individual themselves. As I've mentioned, isolating oneself can lead to further psychological problems. A fear of others, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and delusions of persecution can all result from prolonged social withdrawal. These in turn feed back into the isolation, completing the vicious circle. The second arena is the withdrawn person's family. Usually, hikikomori live with their parents, but have no meaningful contact with them. Sure, family members may pressure them to go outside and go to school or get a job, but this one-sided form of communication only heaps shame and guilt on the withdrawn individual, which makes them want to avoid their family and society, which in turn feeds back into their isolation. The family itself is also under pressure, because they are worried about the withdrawn person's future and are ashamed to have a member of the family who has failed to fit into society. They may also fear that they have personally failed their child, or that the situation is somehow their fault. The family will be delivering speeches and will be trying to give good advice to the withdrawn individual. And when this doesn't work, they get frustrated and will yell at them to get out of their room already and stop freeloading. The withdrawn person, meanwhile, will either not respond at all or will be levying accusations at the family that they raised them wrong, that they failed them. What makes it even sadder is that the accusations the withdrawn person levies at their family already resonate with what the family members fear themselves. When they lash out by directing guilt and shame at the withdrawn person, hoping it will somehow shock them into action, this resonates with how the withdrawn person already feels about themselves, reinforcing their desire to escape from the world. There is a vicious circle in the life of a hikikomori and in the life of the family, and their flawed communication is a cycle in and of itself. The final arena is that of society. Saitou started out the book addressing the negative preconceptions that society has of hikikomori, the kind of opinions that an upstanding citizen would give. Because of this, even successful and socially involved families are quote-unquote close-lipped when it comes to their own child being in a state of withdrawal. They keep it to themselves due to feelings of shame a reason similar to why their child won't talk to them. Saitou writes that in a way the family itself is in a state of withdrawal, lacking meaningful communication with the outside world. Saitou attaches a diagram of 3 circles enclosing one another. The inmost represents the arena of the individual, the middle that of the family, and the outer one of society. Each has their own boundaries, but there is an area of overlap which symbolizes communication. The little arrows inside of the lines indicate how the 3 arenas, while separate, are moving in unison, and they meet briefly at one point and then continue on their own path. This is the model of a healthy system. Now, in the model of a Hikikomori system, the 3 circles have lost contact with one another. The arrows show how pressure is exercised by each circle on the smaller one, and each circle moves around in the opposite direction, showing how they are all doing their own thing without regard for the other. Restoring the points of contact can require a lot of work. According to Saitou, it has to start with the family. The Hikikomori is often unwilling to go out to counseling and may resist treatment altogether. If the family can be instructed into how to restore communication with their child, then perhaps the withdrawn child can have personal counseling later. In any case, real meaningful communication means reciprocity and listening to one another. Even so, this is easier said than done. Saitou confesses that even he sometimes falls prey to the temptation to lecture or reason with his patients. Judgmental thoughts come to mind when listening to some hikikomori, such as that they are simply lazy or spoiled or, quote, griping with their rights while avoiding responsibilities. Even when we are thinking and feeling this way, it is not helpful, Saitou says. Social withdrawal is simply a real problem that needs real solutions. The family needs to be receptive to what the hikikomori has to say and give them time to say it. When their child goes off on them, airing all their grievances, it can be very difficult not to lash out in return. But Saitou believes that after the hikikomori has said what they wanted to say, whether it be right or wrong, truthful or not, eventually they will be done, and then a window opens up for more honest conversation. While the family needs to avoid falling into lecturing and judging, they also can't let the hikikomori have full control over them, twisting them around his or her thumb. In order to be receptive to the hikikomori's grievances, the parents need to be firmly rooted in their goals and intentions. To illustrate this, Saitou cites that a cup cannot hold water if it's bottomless. In order to be receptive, limits and boundaries are required. Parents need a framework to operate on, which becomes their limits and boundaries, with which they can receive what the hikikomori throws at them. The specifics of this framework should be determined between the parents and their consultant, but at least in the early stages it should lead to the parents gaining a better understanding of what the hikikomori has been feeling. Additionally, it should help them to take resolute action if they feel the hikikomori is violating their boundaries, like protecting the cup if someone threatens to break it. Sadly, social withdrawal and domestic violence in Japan seem very closely related. As such, a whole chapter of the book is dedicated to quelling violence in the home. Saitou writes that once again, a lack of consistent personal boundaries and a deep felt sadness on the part of the withdrawn individual are the reasons for this. Often, the individual believes themselves to be beyond forgiveness, but with nowhere else to go with this mental pressure, they end up blaming their parents for it, which kickstarts a vicious circle of violence and self-hatred. Once again, the solution is to separate parent and child and establish them both as individuals. Parents might not know by themselves how to achieve this, which is why it's so important that a specialist is consulted. That specialist can instruct the family according to their own specific conditions and needs, without aggravating the situation. Some steps that can be taken to establish boundaries include temporarily bringing an outsider into the household. When the hikikomori is suddenly confronted with this new outside observer, some domestic violence cases have stopped completely and abruptly. Another approach involves temporarily moving the rest of the family to a different house. While this solution takes a lot of work and might not be fit for the long term, it does establish boundaries simply by creating physical distance. A third approach that Saitou mentions is an obvious but tragically underused one, and that is to simply call the police. Sometimes families dread retribution by the violent member and therefore decide to suffer in silence. But sending a message like, "We are actually prepared to call the police on you," can be very important to the withdrawn individual, because it's another way of involving outsiders and setting boundaries. Domestic violence cases with hikikomori do have some unique aspects. Saitou believes that this kind of violence often stems from mental regression. Mental regression is essentially a mind returning back to a less mature state. This is known to happen in hospital settings, where patients are unable to take care of themselves for extended periods of time. A socially withdrawn person who has mentally regressed will make less of a distinction between themselves and their parents. With this logic, blaming the parents for one's own state of withdrawal seems to make a bit more sense. Despite this, hikikomori aren't always under the illusion that all their problems are their parents' fault, even if they may say so in a fit of rage. Saitou writes how some violent hikikomori have later confessed in treatment that they believed they were terrible people. Saitou brings up a survey which indicates 36% of hikikomori cases demonstrated, quote, reliance on parents and infantile behavior. Infantile behavior could involve physical clinginess to the mother, wanting to have conversations that go on and on and on, speaking in childish voices, and some even sleep in the same room or the same bed as their mothers, not being able to go to sleep otherwise. Saitou even calls these cases not unusual. Some hikikomori will pester their mothers and kick their legs if they don't get what they want, which Saitou considers a sign of having a weak mental boundary between their own being and that of their mother. Interestingly, Saitou throughout the whole book refers to all hikikomori as children. Most cases that he considers are about grown men and women, that is, people who are over the age of 18, but he still explicitly refers to all hikikomori as children. This could be due to the translation, but perhaps it could also mean that being a hikikomori to Saitou carries an inherent lack of maturity, and that the way to heal from being a hikikomori is the same as the process of maturation. In the cases of mental regression and domestic violence, the key is establishing boundaries between parent and child so that the two can recognize each other as independent people who make their own decisions. There is a notion in Japan known as amae. It comes from the verb amaeru, which means to take advantage of or to presume upon. Amae refers to a kind of affectionate dependence on someone higher up the social hierarchy than you. That could be someone like an older sibling, a parent, a teacher, or even a boss. Amae can manifest as wanting to be coddled in some way, as wanting that person higher up the social ladder to do some favor for you, even when asking for that is really unreasonable. Amae can be seen as a form of social bonding by letting people indulge in hierarchical relationships. This isn't as foreign a concept as it sounds like though. There are examples of amae in cultures all over the world. For example, a partner asking their significant other to feed them bites of food, or a kid asking their parents to carry them when they no longer feel like walking. Saitou writes in another book titled How to Save Your Child from Hikikomori that cultural factors like amae may have contributed to the phenomenon of social withdrawal in Japan. If the society encourages indulging in dependency rather than avoiding it like in the West, This could lead to an increase in hikikomori cases, given other factors. Also, unlike in the Western world, it is less customary in Japan for young men and women to move out of the house when coming of age. In Japan, young people stay in their parents' household and transition into the role of caregivers. When this role reversal takes place and the children are now the ones taking care of the parents, they will have fully matured. Whereas in the West, you mature by going out to live on your own. Despite cultural factors like these, Saitou does not believe that social withdrawal is solely a disease of Japanese culture. In every culture in the world, young people may have trouble engaging with society. However, in places where many live with their parents, social withdrawal becomes an option. The Western world first became aware of hikikomori in 2006, when American journalist Michael Zielenziger published Shutting Out the Sun: How Japan Created Its Own Lost Generation. In this book, he accuses Japanese culture itself of having inherent problems that caused the hikikomori epidemic. Saitou responded to this claim by pointing to the fact that besides Japan and South Korea, Italy and Spain also had large rates of children living with their parents. Italy was the only European country at the time taking measures against social withdrawal, and fellow psychiatrists from Spain have told of similar issues in their country. This seems to confirm Saitou's earlier statement that hikikomori can become a phenomenon in countries where the youth normally stays with their parents for longer. Next, Saitou pointed to the then infamous number of 1.6 million homeless and runaway youths in America. In Britain, the number is similarly high at 250,000. Saitou concludes his response to Zielenziger's scathing exposé on Japanese culture by saying, "The point is that in countries like the United States and Britain, the place for young people who find themselves unable to integrate into society is not in the home but on the streets." Saitou mentions contacting psychiatrists from all over the world, asking them questions about social withdrawal in their own country. The responses he got from Western countries seemed to associate social withdrawal with different forms of anxiety and personality disorders. However, a French psychiatrist made an entirely different observation. He noted the large numbers of homelessness among the youth in France and observed that the problems generally started from the first year of middle school. The youth come from broken homes with absent fathers and continue to depend on others into adulthood. His view seems to confirm Saitou's analysis of the situation. Meanwhile, a Thai psychiatrist simply responded to Saitou's email by asking, "But how do they feed themselves?" This shows that social withdrawal is still a first world problem. People can only stay shut away indoors because parents now have the financial means to take care of their children indefinitely. But seeing that social withdrawal is nonetheless a social problem, Saitou makes a few suggestions as to how governments, on both the local and the national level, could take steps to address the problem of hikikomori. As he writes, public health departments could provide family counseling, and associations, such as support groups, for families of hikikomori children could be made. Saitou believes that it's very important that families of hikikomori get into contact with one another, so they can support each other and realize that they are not the only ones. Moreover, hangout places for hikikomori themselves could be created, as well as accessible forms of part-time work to ease them back into social life. At the time of this video, many of such measures have already been taken by the Japanese Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare and by various non-profit organizations. Information about helping hikikomori is readily available online. Given the individualistic nature of the problem, it remains up to hikikomori and their families if they want to make use of them. Tamaki Saitou continues to campaign for understanding and communication between hikikomori, their families, and society. He is a prolific author, writing literature analyzing modern culture through the lens of psychoanalysis, as well as more practical books addressing hikikomori and their problems. For example, he co-authored a book with a rather depressing title called A Life Plan for Hikikomori: What to Do After Your Parents Pass Away. In more recent years, he has authored several books about the Finnish method of open dialogue, an alternative approach for treating mental health disorders and psychosis. As open dialogue is based on free and unplanned conversation between several individuals in a group setting, you can see Saitou's own beliefs and practices reflected in it. He has even co-authored a manga comic about the practice, meant to encourage people to try it out for themselves, with 6 short stories. He even stars in it as a manga-fied version of himself, or Tamaki Sensei. Moreover, the manga seems to contain snippets from his own life story. I personally feel that it is such a shame that the majority of his work will probably never be translated. The man clearly has a lot to say, and I am sure that Western audiences would be interested to hear him, seeing as what kind of public intellectuals are popular in the English-speaking sphere. Only one other book by Saitou has been translated into English, titled Beautiful Fighting Girl. While his book on Hikikomori felt more professional, this second title delves into Saitou's personal obsessions. It describes the psychology of anime-obsessed nerds, or otaku, using the theories of French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, connecting everything to the work of American outsider artist Henry Darger. Suffice it to say, it contains a lot more theorizing and speculation, and is a lot harder to read. This contrasts with his book on Hikikomori, which was written for the broader public and played it safer, sticking to mostly accepted psychological facts. However, in the final chapter of the book on Hikikomori, Saitou does leave the reader with an ambitious piece of analysis and social criticism. He notes that in schools nowadays, children are encouraged to believe that they can be anything when they grow up. The infinite spectrum of possibilities lies ahead of them, but they cannot yet choose a path and join society. They have to keep existing in this superposition, where they could be anything but are nothing yet. Saitou draws on the theories of Sigmund Freud and Lacan, stating that at the beginning of their development, human beings believe that they are all-powerful. Through interacting with other people, they slowly begin to realize that they are, in fact, very limited in their abilities. Through repeated interactions with other people, the person loses their sense of omnipotence and therefore begins to require the presence of other people in their life. Saitou uses the term castration to refer to this process, which is a term that derives from psychoanalysis and is to be taken more symbolically than literally. The problem with schools is that they tempt students to disavow their castration by encouraging them to engage in the fantasy that they could be anything. This is a real temptation for the students, because people want to believe that they are all-powerful. Therefore, the fantasy that you can really be or do anything is very tempting. Even if the students tried to resist, they would only end up removing themselves from their social sphere. Once in a state of withdrawal, the person would have no more chance of being castrated, since castration is forced on people from the outside. Hikikomori suffer from this most intensely. Totally isolated from social life, their mind remains stuck in a childish state of omnipotence, while they very well know that they are powerless in the world. A vivid picture of this state of being is sketched elsewhere in the book, where Saitou describes a scene of a hikikomori looking into a mirror. At one moment, they see themselves brimming with potential, full of power and possibility, and then that image suddenly changes, and they see a miserable self who has no value and no reason to live. People need social interaction in order to stabilize their self-image and become emotionally mature. Otherwise, they remain in their own world, all-powerful but useless, stuck in adolescence without end. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more videos about culture, media, and psychology. I hope to see you all in the next one.